The badge on the kitchen counter had only one name on it. Laurel Mercer. Analyst rotation, no family connection. No special title. Nothing that said the chairman of Northstar Civic Systems had packed her school lunches, taught her to drive, or raised her alone since she was 8. Laurel slipped the badge into her bag and reached for her trench coat. "You're staring at it again," she said. Gideon Mercer looked up from his coffee. At 49, he had spent enough years in boardrooms to know when silence was being used against him. This time, his daughter was right. "I'm not staring. You've been reading my badge for 30 seconds. I'm chairman. Reading things twice is practically the job." Laurel smiled despite herself. Outside their Chicago windows, late October rain streaked the glass. Laurel wore a cream turtleneck beneath a charcoal blazer, dark trousers, and a belted raincoat. Gideon had already dressed for the board meeting he would attend later that morning, though his navy overcoat still hung beside the door. For years, he had been able to solve most problems by making a call. That was exactly what Laurel didn't want. She had earned her place in Northstar's analyst rotation through the regular recruiting process, and she had made her father promise that once she walked through those doors, he would stay out of her career. Gideon had agreed. He was beginning to understand that keeping that promise might be harder than making it. "Before we go any further, how old are you? Where are you watching from? And have you ever faced something similar? You remember the rule?" Laurel asked. "No calls to HR. No checking with your manager. No mysterious chairman appearances. And," Gideon sighed, "no asking anyone how your first day went. Especially that one." He picked up his coffee. "You've removed every enjoyable part of being an overprotective father. I'm 24. You say that like 24-year-olds suddenly stop having fathers." Laurel's expression softened. She knew where his instinct came from. After years of raising her alone, Gideon had developed a habit of treating uncertainty like a problem requiring immediate action. A late train meant a ride was already coming. A bad landlord meant Gideon had a lawyer's number ready. A difficult decision meant he had 3 solutions before Laurel had finished describing it. His love was never the problem. Sometimes, the way he used it was. At 7:42, Laurel shouldered her bag. Gideon resisted the urge to remind her about the weather, the train schedule, or the presentation she had mentioned the night before. Instead, he opened the door. "Go earn your bad day," he said. She laughed. "That's your motivational speech? Good days teach you nothing." That sounds suspiciously like something a chairman says after ruining everyone's Monday. She kissed his cheek and disappeared toward the elevator. Gideon remained in the doorway until the doors closed. Then he looked at his phone. Northstar's corporate secretary had sent an update. Board meeting moved to 10:30. Executive conference room. He almost texted Laurel that he would be in the building. He stopped himself. A promise was a promise. Across downtown, Laurel entered Northstar's glass headquarters with rain still shining on her coat. She checked in, joined the other new analysts, and followed them upstairs to orientation. On the schedule was something nobody had mentioned during recruitment. 9 a.m. Executive Readiness Review. One trainee beside her whispered, "On day 1. Before Laurel could answer, the conference room doors opened. Someone at the front straightened immediately. "CEO's coming." The casual chatter vanished. Laurel looked down at the presentation packet waiting at her seat. On page 6, one maintenance cost number didn't match the supporting data. She checked it again, then a third time. It was wrong, and footsteps were already approaching the door. Laurel was still checking the number when Vivian Sloan walked into the room. No announcement. No assistant asking everyone to stand. The CEO simply entered in a tailored black suit, set a leather folder on the conference table, and looked across the new hires. Every whispered conversation stopped. "Keep your seats," Vivian said. "You'll need the energy." A few nervous smiles appeared. Laurel looked back at page 6. The maintenance projection showed $18.4 million. The supporting table suggested something closer to $21 million. Maybe she was missing an adjustment, but she couldn't find one. The executive readiness review moved fast. Each trainee had 3 minutes to explain a recommendation based on the packet they had received less than an hour earlier. Vivian interrupted often. "Why? What evidence supports that? Would you put your name on that decision?" By the time Laurel's name was called, 2 analysts had already walked back to their seats looking shaken. She stood and carried her notes to the front. For the first minute, everything went smoothly. Then she reached the maintenance forecast. "I wouldn't recommend approving this projection yet," Laurel said. Vivian leaned back. Why not? The summary and the supporting data don't reconcile. Then reconcile them. I tried. We're missing the assumption that explains the difference. Vivian glanced at the clock. So your recommendation is that you don't have a recommendation? No. My recommendation is that we verify the source before presenting a number as reliable. A few heads lifted. Vivian's expression hardened. In this company, Ms. Mercer, clients don't pay us to explain why we're uncomfortable making decisions. Laurel felt heat rise into her face. I'm not uncomfortable making a decision. Then make one. Not with a number I believe may be wrong. The room went still. Vivian walked toward her. What do you think happens when a city commissioner asks you a question and you say the spreadsheet made you nervous? That isn't what I said. It came out before Laurel could soften it. Vivian stopped. Your badge. Laurel blinked. Excuse me. Take it off. 30 people watched. Laurel slowly unclipped the badge from her blazer. Vivian pointed to the table. Put it down. Laurel did. Northstar hires people who can function under pressure, Vivian said. Not people who stand in front of a problem and explain why they weren't ready for it. The embarrassment was sharp, but what hurt more was knowing the data was still wrong. I was given the same packet everyone else was, and everyone else managed to finish. That doesn't make the number accurate. Vivian stared at her for a moment, then turned toward the HR coordinator. Have security escort Ms. Mercer out of orientation. HR can decide whether she returns tomorrow. Nobody laughed. Laurel almost wished someone had. Instead, 29 strangers studied their laptops as if looking at her might make them next. A security officer appeared at the doorway. Laurel picked up her bag, but left the badge where Vivian had told her to put it. Then the doors behind the officer opened again. 2 men entered. The first was Northstar's corporate secretary. The second wore a dark gray suit beneath a navy overcoat, its shoulders still dotted with October rain. Laurel stopped breathing for half a second. Gideon stopped too. His eyes moved from the security officer to his daughter, then to the badge lying alone on the conference table. Vivian's posture changed immediately. Mr. Mercer, I thought the board meeting was upstairs. It was moved. Someone near the back whispered, That's the chairman. Vivian looked at the badge, then at Laurel, then back at Gideon. The room understood before anyone said it. Gideon's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He walked to the table and looked at his daughter. Not Vivian. Not HR. Laurel. Do you want me to step in? It was the easiest rescue Laurel would ever be offered. She looked at the badge, at Vivian, and finally at the father who had promised that morning not to fight her battles for her. No, Laurel said. Gideon's expression barely moved, but his hands did. He slowly unclenched them. All right. Vivian seemed almost more unsettled by that answer than she would have been by a threat. Laurel picked up her coat. She walked past her father without asking him to follow. And for the first time that morning, Gideon Mercer faced a problem his power could solve in seconds, and understood that using it might cost his daughter something he couldn't give back. Laurel made it halfway down the hall before Gideon caught up with her. Conference room, he said quietly. I said I don't want you stepping in. I heard you. Then why are you following me? Because I'm still your father. Laurel stopped. That's exactly the problem. Gideon glanced toward the employees pretending not to watch them. He opened the door to an empty conference room and waited. Laurel entered. The second the door closed, Gideon pulled out his phone. I can have Vivian removed from personnel decisions before lunch. Laurel stared at him. You've got to be kidding. She had security called on you for questioning bad data. And 5 minutes ago, I told you not to interfere. This isn't interference. It's governance. No, Dad. It's interference with a better vocabulary. That landed. Gideon lowered the phone. She humiliated you in front of 30 people. I was there. She threatened your job. I know. And I'm supposed to do nothing? Laurel folded her arms. If Vivian gets suspended 10 minutes after everyone finds out I'm your daughter, what do you think people will remember? That she crossed a line. No. They'll remember that Laurel Mercer can get the CEO punished by calling Daddy. Gideon's face tightened. You didn't call me. That won't matter. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain tapped against the windows. Gideon had spent 16 years solving problems before they could reach Laurel. When she was 8, protection meant learning how to braid hair badly because there was no one else to do it. At 14, it meant waiting outside a school dance because she was scared to ask for a ride home. At 24, He was discovering that the same instinct could feel very different from the other side. "You want me to pretend this didn't happen?" he asked. "No. I want you to let me decide what happens to me." Gideon looked away. The distinction irritated him because he understood it. A knock came at the door. Northstar's HR director stepped inside. "Laurel, we'd like to discuss options." "Options? We can remove the incident from your file and place you with another rotation team while we review what happened." Gideon immediately said, "Her file shouldn't have an incident in the first place." Laurel shot him a look. He stopped. The HR director continued carefully. "Your compensation and standing would remain unchanged." Laurel nodded once. "I'll think about it." After she left, Gideon waited until the door clicked shut. "You're actually considering going back?" "I worked for months to get here." "You could work anywhere." Laurel gave a tired laugh. That. What? You always say that because you know people everywhere. You think every closed door is just a door you can open. I want you to have choices. I want some of them to be mine." Gideon slipped his phone into his pocket. That afternoon, Northstar's corporate counsel sent Vivian formal notice that the chairman had disclosed a family conflict and requested independent handling of Laurel's employment status. Vivian read the message twice. She had expected anger, a demand, maybe even a threat. Instead, Gideon Mercer had deliberately put distance between himself and the decision. That bothered her more. Downstairs, Laurel sat alone in the lobby cafe with the orientation packet open beside a cold cup of coffee. She should have been thinking about whether to accept HR's transfer. Instead, she kept returning to the same question. Not why Vivian had treated her that way. Something else. Laurel took out a pen and wrote it across the margin of page 6. "What would have happened if my last name wasn't Mercer?" She stared at the sentence. Then she opened her laptop. By 3 that afternoon, Laurel had been offered almost everything she needed to make the morning disappear. Vivian sat across from her with the HR director between them. "You'll keep your salary," Vivian said. "Same rotation program, different team. Senior mentor. Clean record." Laurel looked at the printed transfer form. "And this morning? Recorded as a misunderstanding during an evaluation exercise. Was it?" Vivian paused. "I'm offering you a way forward." It was a good offer. That was what bothered Laurel. She could sign, go home, return tomorrow, and never sit across from Vivian again. Laurel pushed the form back. "I need to understand something first. If my father weren't chairman, would I still be getting this meeting?" The HR director glanced down. Vivian didn't. "You're getting this meeting because the situation requires review." "That isn't what I asked." "No," Vivian said evenly. "It isn't." Laurel left without signing. Back at the lobby cafe, she opened Northstar's employee portal. She wasn't looking for complaints about Vivian. She wanted to know how someone could be removed from an orientation room on day 1 without anyone asking whether the underlying data was actually wrong. The answer wasn't in one dramatic policy. It was scattered across performance documents. Managers were scored on something called rapid talent differentiation. Teams received stronger evaluations when supervisors identified high-value performers early and moved low-confidence personnel out quickly. The language sounded clean, efficient, almost responsible. Laurel kept reading. The Executive Readiness Review wasn't officially designed to embarrass anyone. It was supposed to test decision-making under pressure. But managers were rewarded for making fast judgments. And Vivian had built a reputation on making them faster than anyone. Laurel opened an archived governance summary. 3 years earlier, Northstar had been struggling. The board had approved a new performance framework meant to make the company more decisive. She scrolled through the committee approvals, then stopped. Compensation and Culture Committee, approved. Below it was a list of board members. At the top, Gideon Mercer, committee chair. Laurel stared at her father's name. Across the city, Gideon was still angry at Vivian. He hadn't yet considered that anger might be the easier emotion. His phone buzzed. A message from Laurel. "Can you come home early tonight? We need to talk." Gideon typed immediately. "Of course." 3 dots appeared. Then another message arrived. "And don't call anyone at Northstar before we do." Gideon read it twice. For the first time since walking into that conference room, he wondered whether Laurel had found something worse than what Vivian had done. Something that might lead back to him. The governance summary was already on the kitchen table when Gideon came home. Laurel had changed out of her blazer, but she was still wearing the cream turtleneck from that morning. Her laptop sat open beside 2 untouched mugs of coffee. Gideon removed his damp overcoat. You found my name. Laurel looked up. You knew. I chaired that committee. That isn't what I asked. Gideon pulled out a chair. No. I didn't know what you'd found until I saw the document. Laurel turned the laptop toward him. Rapid Talent Differentiation Framework. Approved. His name appeared beneath it. You voted for this? I did. Why? Because 3 years ago Northstar was losing contracts, missing deadlines, and carrying managers who refused to make decisions. So the solution was teaching people to get rid of anyone who hesitated? That wasn't the solution. That's what the system rewards. Gideon started to answer, then stopped. He read the page again. For years, Laurel had seen him as the person who knew how companies worked. Tonight, he looked like a man discovering that something he'd built had traveled farther than he intended. I thought we were rewarding accountability, he said. You rewarded speed. At the time, we needed speed. And Vivian gave you exactly what you asked for. Gideon leaned back. That doesn't excuse what she did. I didn't say it did. Then what are you saying? Laurel closed the laptop. I'm saying firing her tomorrow would be easy. The word easy irritated him. She publicly humiliated you. And if you fire her because I'm your daughter, what changes for the next analyst whose father isn't chairman? Gideon was silent. Laurel slid another document across the table. It was the transfer offer. I can sign this tomorrow. Clean record. Different team. Senior mentor. You're not signing that. Her eyes narrowed. Gideon heard himself. He rubbed a hand over his face. Sorry. Your decision. I'm turning it down. He looked at her sharply. Why? Because I don't want a better version of special treatment. This isn't special treatment. HR is trying to correct what happened. Would they be trying this hard if my name were Laurel Bennett? Gideon couldn't answer honestly with yes. She continued. I want an independent review. Fine. I'll authorize one. No, Laurel, I want you out of it. The room went quiet. Gideon stared at her. You want me to recuse myself? Yes. From a review involving the CEO and my own daughter? Especially from that review. He stood and walked toward the window. Chicago glowed through the rain below them. If I step out, I can't control who gets assigned. I can't guarantee what they decide. I know. You could lose your place in the program. I know. They could decide Vivian's conduct was aggressive but technically allowed. I know. Gideon turned around. Then why would you ask me to give up the one thing that guarantees you won't get buried by this? Laurel's voice softened. Because if fairness only works when you're in the room, Dad, then it isn't fairness. He looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't asking him to protect her. She was asking him to trust a process he no longer trusted himself. That frightened him more. He had spent 16 years believing a good father stood between his daughter and whatever could hurt her. Now she was asking him to move. Gideon sat again. When your mom died, you were 8, he said. Everybody kept telling me you'd need space to process things. I hated that word. Space. It sounded like doing nothing. Laurel's expression changed. So I fixed things. Lunches. School problems. Broken heaters. Bad landlords. Whatever I could reach. I know. I got good at reaching. I know that too. He gave a small, tired smile. And now you want me to keep my hands off this. I want you to let me own what happens next. Gideon looked at the transfer form, then at his name on the old committee approval. Finally, he nodded. All right. Laurel exhaled. But if I'm recusing myself, he said, we do it completely. No private updates. No calls to counsel asking how it's going. No pressure from my office. Yes. You understand I may hate every second of that. I was counting on it. That earned the first real smile either of them had managed all day. The next morning, Gideon sent a formal notice to the board secretary. He disclosed his relationship to Laurel, his previous role in approving the performance framework, and his decision to recuse himself from all findings involving her complaint. His finger hovered over send. Then he pressed it. Across the kitchen, Laurel watched. Gideon closed the laptop. There. Laurel nodded. Thank you. He looked at his daughter. Don't thank me yet. She picked up her coffee. I'm not thanking you for fixing it. A beat passed. I'm thanking you for not trying to. And for Gideon Mercer, that distinction changed everything. 3 days later, Gideon received a document he was technically allowed to read and personally wished he had never seen. It wasn't the independent review itself. His recusal prevented that. It was an old board memo from 3 years earlier. Across the top were the words. Building a culture of decisiveness at the bottom was his signature. Gideon sat alone in his office, reading language that once sounded reasonable. Reduce management hesitation. Identify low-confidence performers earlier. Reward decisive talent allocation. Nothing said humiliate a 24-year-old in front of 30 coworkers. Nothing said take away her badge. But Gideon could finally see the road between the words on the page and what had happened to Laurel. Meanwhile, the independent panel was finding something equally uncomfortable. There wasn't a secret file full of employees accusing Vivian of cruelty. There was no single smoking gun. There were numbers. Teams that relied heavily on executive readiness reviews lost new employees at a higher rate during their first year. Managers who removed trainees quickly, however, often received stronger leadership scores. The company had been measuring decisiveness. People had learned to perform it. Vivian sat before the panel that Thursday afternoon. "You're suggesting the board caused my conduct?" she asked. External counsel shook his head. "No. We're asking whether the incentive structure encouraged it. That's a convenient distinction. It's an important one." Vivian folded her hands. "When I became CEO, Northstar was missing deadlines and losing contracts because managers were afraid to make hard calls. The board told me to change that culture. And you believed public pressure was necessary?" "I believed pressure revealed judgment." "Did the framework require you to order Ms. Mercer to remove her badge?" Vivian's silence lasted just long enough to answer. "No." "Did it require security?" "No." "So those were your decisions?" Vivian looked toward the window. "Yes." That evening, Laurel found Gideon at home with the old memo spread across the kitchen table. He wasn't supposed to discuss the review with her, so he didn't. Instead, he tapped his signature. "I remember this meeting." Laurel sat across from him. "You thought you were helping." "I thought intentions counted for more than they do." "They count. Not to the person standing at the end of the consequences." Laurel studied him. A few days earlier, she had wanted him to understand that Vivian wasn't the whole problem. Now she saw something she hadn't expected. He wasn't trying to escape his part in it. "I was angry at her because she hurt you," Gideon said. "That part hasn't changed." "It shouldn't." But anger made the story simple. "She did something wrong. I stop her. Problem solved. And now." He looked down at the memo. "Now I think maybe I like the simple version because I got to be the good guy." Laurel didn't rush to comfort him. Gideon had spent years protecting her from consequences. This one belonged to him. The following morning, the panel requested archived board communications from the year the framework was adopted. Gideon authorized access through the corporate secretary without asking what they expected to find. Then he returned to his office and waited. No private calls. No favors. No instructions. Just waiting. It was one of the least impressive things Gideon Mercer had ever done with power. And one of the hardest. Across town, Laurel received a calendar invitation. Independent review. Witness statement. She stared at the screen. Until that moment, this had still been something that happened to her. Clicking accept would make it something she chose to carry forward. Laurel moved the cursor over the button. Then clicked. The warning arrived Friday morning in language designed not to sound like one. Northstar's general counsel placed a folder in front of Gideon. "If the review becomes part of a formal board action, we may have a disclosure issue." Gideon didn't touch the folder. "With the city contract? The bid committee can request information about material leadership disputes. We're 3 weeks from final consideration. And if they request it, we answer truthfully." Gideon looked at him. "What you're really telling me is that honesty could cost us the contract." "I'm telling you hundreds of employees could feel the consequences of how the board handles this." That was the first argument Gideon couldn't dismiss as cowardice. Northstar employed people who had nothing to do with Vivian, Laurel, or an old performance framework. Engineers had mortgages. Assistants had kids. Project teams had spent 2 years preparing that bid. There was another path. The board could treat Vivian's conduct as an individual leadership failure, remove her if necessary, revise a few policies, and close the matter without examining its own role publicly. Clean. Fast. Exactly the kind of solution Gideon once would have admired. His phone buzzed. A text from Laurel. "Can we talk tonight?" She sounded different when she arrived home. Not frightened. Tired. At the independent review, Laurel had described the orientation room, the badge, the security officer, and the incorrect data. Afterward, 2 coworkers had avoided her in the elevator. Someone else had finally said what others were apparently thinking. "You know, people are worried this could blow up the whole company because you got embarrassed, right?" Laurel repeated the sentence to Gideon over dinner. He set down his fork. Who said that? She gave him a look. Right. Sorry. I thought I'd be okay with people being angry. You don't have to be okay with it. What if they're right about part of it? They aren't. Dad. Gideon stopped. Laurel stared at the table. If this costs people jobs, I get to go home to the chairman of the company. They don't. There it was again. The temptation to make everything smaller. Gideon could tell her to withdraw. He could tell her to fight. Both would let him feel useful. Instead, he asked, "What do you want?" "I don't know." It was probably the most honest answer she'd given all week. Gideon nodded. "Then you don't have to know tonight." Laurel looked up. "The panel hasn't finished," he continued. "Whatever you decide about your statement, I'll live with it." "You'd really let me withdraw?" "I wouldn't like it." "That wasn't my question." "Yes. And if I continue, I'll live with that too." She watched him carefully, almost waiting for the advice that always came next. It didn't. The next morning, Laurel walked along the lakefront in a wool coat, hands buried in her pockets against the sharp Chicago wind. She kept thinking about independence. All week, she'd treated it like refusing help. But silence could become its own kind of pride. If she withdrew only to prove that she wasn't using her father's power, then her father would still be controlling her decision, just in reverse. Laurel stopped near the water and took out her phone. She opened the email from Independent Counsel. "Please confirm whether you wish your statement to remain part of the final record." Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she typed, "Yes. Keep it in." She pressed send. Across the city, Gideon stood in his office looking at the municipal bid folder. For the first time, father and daughter were making separate decisions that could hurt them both. Neither could protect the other from what came next. And maybe that was the point. The chairman's seat was empty when the special board session began. Gideon stood near the windows instead. At the center of the table sat the independent panel's final report, thick enough that nobody could pretend the problem had been one bad morning. Vivian Sloan sat across from the independent directors. Laurel wasn't in the room. Her statement was. The lead director opened the meeting. The review found that Ms. Sloan violated Northstar's leadership conduct standards in her treatment of Ms. Mercer. Vivian didn't flinch. The review also found, he continued, that elements of Northstar's performance framework created incentives for premature personnel judgments and rewarded managers for aggressive talent differentiation. One director leaned forward. "So which is it? Leadership misconduct or a defective system?" "Both." Silence. Vivian finally spoke. "I won't pretend I handled Laurel correctly." It was the first time Gideon had heard her use his daughter's first name. "I embarrassed her. I escalated when I didn't need to. Calling security was my decision." She placed one hand on the report. "But I didn't invent the culture I was running." Nobody interrupted. For 3 years, this board praised lower decision times, faster personnel movement, and managers who identified weak performers early. Every quarter, you told leadership to move faster. Her eyes settled briefly on Gideon. "I moved faster." Gideon could have answered defensively. Instead, he walked to the table. "I know." Several heads turned. Gideon placed the old committee memo beside the independent report. "My signature is on the framework." A director frowned. "Gideon, you've already disclosed that." "I disclosed a conflict. That's not the same as accepting responsibility." The room became very still. When this framework passed, I believed Northstar needed decisiveness. I still believe leadership requires hard decisions. But we created incentives without paying enough attention to what people would do to satisfy them. Vivian watched him carefully. Gideon continued. "That does not excuse Ms. Sloan's choices. The framework never told her to humiliate an employee. It never told her to remove Laurel's badge or call security." He paused. "But if we fire one person, announce that the problem is solved, and leave our own decisions out of the record, we're doing exactly what this system taught everyone else to do. Identify the problem fast," the lead director said. "And remove it faster," Gideon replied. The municipal contract hung over the room without anyone needing to mention it. Then Gideon reached for the chairman's voting packet. He closed it. "I will not vote on Ms. Sloan's employment status." One director looked surprised. "You have the right to." "That's why it matters that I don't." Gideon pushed the packet away. "I've recused myself from Laurel's case. I'm extending that recusal to any disciplinary decision arising directly from it. Independent directors should decide." For once, Vivian had no immediate response. The vote proceeded without him. The board removed Vivian's authority over personnel decisions while determining whether she could continue as CEO under revised governance. There was no dramatic firing. No security officer waiting outside. Vivian simply heard the decision and nodded. Then came the harder vote. Northstar suspended the rapid talent differentiation framework. Forced ranking would be removed from management evaluations. New employees would receive a documented appeal process. Executive readiness reviews could no longer affect employment status without secondary review. The measures passed. Gideon wasn't finished. One more item. The corporate secretary looked up. "I want my position on the culture committee reviewed." A director stared at him. "You're asking us to investigate you?" "I'm asking the board to decide whether the person who helped approve the old framework should be responsible for designing its replacement." That question had no comfortable answer, which was exactly why Gideon wanted it asked. Later, he found Laurel waiting downstairs. She stood when he approached. "Well, I can't discuss everything yet, Dad." He smiled faintly. "Independent process. Remember?" She rolled her eyes, but then saw his expression. "What did you do?" "I didn't vote." Laurel stared at him. "You didn't?" "No, even after what Vivian did. Especially after what Vivian did." She searched his face. For most of her life, Gideon's strength had meant stepping forward. Tonight, he had stepped aside. "Did you defend her?" Laurel asked. "No, did you defend yourself?" Gideon thought about the question. "No," Laurel nodded slowly. Outside, cold rain had begun falling over Chicago again. Gideon reached for his overcoat. Laurel picked up hers. Neither of them knew what the city would do with Northstar's contract, what the board would ultimately decide about Vivian, or what Laurel's future at the company looked like. Nothing had been magically repaired. But as they walked toward the doors, Laurel understood something she hadn't on her first morning there. Her father hadn't used his power to make sure she won. He had used it to make sure winning wasn't his decision to make. By late February, Laurel Mercer was standing outside Northstar's headquarters again. This time, snow covered the sidewalk where October rain had fallen on her first day. She wore a dark green wool coat over a navy sweater, black trousers, and winter boots. In her hand was a new employee badge. Laurel Mercer, analyst. I no special title. No executive sponsor. No promotion. After the original rotation review was invalidated, Laurel had been required to apply again under the revised process. She had done exactly that, and she had earned the position. Northstar hadn't escaped the consequences of what happened. The city delayed its decision on the municipal contract while reviewing the company's governance changes. Some clients asked uncomfortable questions. The board spent months rebuilding procedures it should have examined years earlier. Vivian Sloan eventually submitted her resignation after completing a transition period. There was no scene where she was marched through the lobby in disgrace. No cheering employees. No final humiliation. Before leaving, Vivian sent Laurel a short message. "I was wrong about what happened in that room. Pressure can reveal character. It can also reveal the character of the person applying it. I should have understood the difference." Laurel didn't forgive everything because of one message, but she kept it. Gideon remained chairman, although he stepped away from the culture committee. Independent directors were given greater authority over workplace conduct reviews, and managers could no longer turn a 3-minute pressure exercise into an employment decision. None of it made Northstar perfect. That was never the point. That morning, Gideon drove Laurel through the snow until they reached the train station. He pulled over. Laurel looked outside. "You're dropping me here? You told me you wanted to take the train." "I did." Gideon nodded toward Northstar's building several blocks away. For 16 years, his instinct had been to take his daughter all the way to the door. Laurel reached for her bag. Then she noticed he wasn't moving. "You're not coming in?" Gideon smiled. "You didn't ask me to." Laurel laughed softly. "Look at you. Learning boundaries. Don't get used to it." She opened the door, then paused. "Dad." "Yeah. Thanks." "For what?" Laurel considered it. "For being there when I need you." A small smile crossed his face. "And for knowing I don't always need you in front of me." Gideon nodded. That part took longer. Laurel stepped into the cold and pulled her coat tighter. As she walked toward the station, Gideon watched her go. Not because he doubted she could make it alone. Because he finally understood that loving someone and controlling their path were not the same thing. And maybe that's what this story leaves us with. A person's worth should never depend on a last name, a job title, a bank account, or who happens to walk through the door behind them. Wealth does not make someone more human, and poverty does not make someone less deserving of dignity. The person in an expensive suit and the person counting every dollar until payday both carry fears, hopes, families, and stories we may know nothing about. Respect should not arrive only after we discover that someone is powerful. Love and basic human decency should not be rewards reserved for people we consider successful. If we treat someone poorly because we assume they are poor, unimportant, or unable to fight back, then discovering later that they have power doesn't suddenly make our earlier behavior wrong. It was already wrong. Laurel disappeared into the station crowd. Gideon didn't follow. He simply watched for another second, smiled to himself, and drove away. And Laurel kept walking, not as the chairman's daughter, not as the young woman a CEO had once ordered out of a room, but as herself. This time, the badge on her coat belonged entirely to her.